Dan, I'm curious, do you know how many virtual desktops a user can get out of one cloud instance?
Oh, it's easy. 42.
42. But I didn't even tell you what type of user, what type of instance, which cloud. How did you come up with 42?
It's always 42. It's always the answer. But in all seriousness, the sizing VDI, it's this it's a fun topic. It's something I've talked about for many years. At the synergies of many moons past. But now, when we're looking at this, it's there's different things to take into account when we're looking in the cloud world.
Yeah, I mean, when you looked at the VDI on-prem, you had to estimate how many servers just to figure out what you needed to buy, rack, stack. But with cloud, it's a whole different world, right? Now you have to concern yourself with the usage costs so that it's not astronomically high. And then, all the different types that you have, like D2, F16 instances, it's super complicated.
Yeah, there's so many different things, and then you have to think about, are you using, which cloud provider are you using? They have different instances, they have different specs, different hardware allocations you want to do with this, and there's a lot of things to consider when you're talking about VDI in the cloud, and that's why we bring in one of our consulting experts. Brian is here to help us get through some of these questions that we have on sizing VDI in the cloud environment. So, Brian, welcome to TechZone Live.
Dan and Anna, thank you so much for having me.
So, I hear you're the expert on all things VDI sizing in the cloud now.
I've had my fair share of cloud experience. I've been working with our consulting services for a little over 5 years now, and the last couple of years I've really entrenched myself in our public cloud deployments and been working with some of our biggest public cloud and Citrix cloud virtual apps and desktops deployments over the last couple of years. So I definitely have some very relevant experience to share.
Well, I know what one of the things that I always wonder about, and last time a lot of us got together was in 2019 at Synergy, and there's always talk about a lot of people don't want to move to the cloud. Is that changing now? Like, are you seeing more people doing cloud VDI deployments than you were just 1 or 2 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest change that I've seen is on the enterprise front. A lot of big customers, like think 10, 15, 20,000 concurrent users, are starting to think very seriously and start to actually design and deploy for large scale Citrix cloud deployments, which is very exciting. Even as large as 50, 60, 70,000. So we're really getting to push some of our Citrix cloud limits that we have currently defined, and as those keep expanding, we're continuing to find use cases to meet them.
Cool.
That's awesome. And I think a lot of the reasons why people were afraid to move to the cloud were the costs, right? It's just complicated to know how to size your VDIs so that you're not paying a ton of money. And so I think that's a good segue for you to kind of tell us. I'm seeing that you have a top 6 list of how to size your VDI. So, number one, why top 6? Well, I guess we'll learn, but is it a reason?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, first, I have a colleague, Nick Rentalen, who many of you may have heard either speak or seen some of his blogs. He's already claimed dibs on the 5 and 10 with his rule of 5 and 10 for scalability. So, I couldn't do that. And I don't know, 6, I feel like 6 gets a bit of a bad rap. I know that there's like the devil association, which is not good, of course. But some of my favorite things come in sixes. We have 6-packs, 6-string guitars. During the holiday seasons, which just passed, we have 6 geese a lane. And overall, I think there's a lot to like about 6, and I'm hoping that this top 6 list really helps with your public cloud
That's awesome.
deployment.
That's awesome.
All right, starting off with number one, we're going to focus here on power management. So one of the biggest things you'll learn as you begin your public cloud journey or continue on your public cloud journey is that machine uptime is directly equates to cost. The more that your machines are up, the more you're going to have to pay. There is some exceptions here with things like reserved instances that we'll talk about on future slides here. But the key thing here to take away is that the more that your machines are powered on, the more you're going to have to pay for them. So what do we do about that? Well, fortunately, we have a built-in tool to the virtual apps and desktop service called Citrix Autoscale. This replaces some of the legacy Smart Scale and Smart Tools that was previously available with the on-prem product. But Autoscale allows you to define either load-based or schedule-based power management of your machines, or you can automatically power on and power off your either VDI or RDS-based workloads based on certain parameters that you set.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things I think with moving to the cloud is that when you were on-prem, you already own the hardware, so keep it up and running all the time. But on the cloud, you're paying for usage. So if you're not using it, shut it off.
Yep, exactly. So it becomes pretty critical just to reevaluate some of those timeouts just to make sure that we're not keeping machines up unnecessarily. All right, let's jump into number two here. So after we look at some of the power management options, one of the first things I definitely recommend evaluating is the operating system that we're ultimately going to deploy on. I've seen a couple customers burned on their desire just to take a VDI model and push that directly into public cloud without really thinking too much about some of the cost implications. So when we're looking at deploying workloads, obviously if we have VDI, that's going to be a one-to-one model, and there's a lot higher costs associated with that because each user gets their own dedicated resources, and if a user is not actively using those resources, they're just sitting there idle and still having to be paid for. So what we recommend here is reevaluating and making sure that we're really thinking about leveraging multi-session OS machines to optimize our machine or server scalability. So whether that's either RDS server-based workload like Server 2016 or Server 2019, or if you want to evaluate the new Windows 10 multi-session, which I have a couple customers working on right now, there's the added benefit of not having to pay for those RDS Cal licensing costs.
And
So,
Brian,
yeah, go on.
so I think your recommendation is to start with multi-session OS, and if it doesn't make sense, go to a single user OS. What are some of the use cases that you've seen that it's like a hard multi-session OS just doesn't work, where you have to go to that dedicated?
Yeah, good question. And that's a great summary that we would always recommend leading with multi-session where possible and then falling back to VDI. Two key use cases that I've seen be most applicable are first, a more developer use case where users have to install applications and there's a ton of customization requirements on that OS that doesn't usually fit well within a shared desktop model. And then another one is the use of applications that may not be multi-user aware. So if an application can't have multiple users logging into the same server and launching it from, that's another key use case where we would need to bring that back to a VDI model.
That's great to know. Thanks.
Yeah, no, great question. Oh. All right. Continuing on the theme here, we're going to jump into licensing. So the first thing I'd mention was about the power management and making sure that machines are being power cycled when possible to reduce machine uptime. However, what if you have use case where users need to, maybe they need to run scripts that run for 12 hours, or they're just on their machine for extended period of time where it doesn't necessarily make sense to be powering them down. When we get into this, this is where we start to recommend things like reserved instances or committed use discounts. So what are these? So reserved instances, which is the naming for AWS and Azure, this is where you go ahead and you're purchasing reserved capacity within the public cloud provider's data center, and that capacity is yours, and you're prepaying for a set period of time. So looking at the diagram below, we show the comparison of both a 1-year and 3-year reserved instance. So this is where you're paying for that specific VM for a certain period of time. And then you can see the comparison against the pay-as-you-go. So you can see there's a crossing point here at around 18 hours, like 16 to 18 hours. So if we know that users are going to be needing to be accessing machines for more than 16 to 18 hours a day, or if we're looking at our infrastructure servers that are going to be on 24/7, it usually makes sense to be buying reserved instances where we know that we're always going to have those machines on, and it's going to ultimately be more cost efficient to purchase those reserved instances. Jumping into number 4 here, let's talk a bit about the resource allocation on our workloads. So historically, what we've seen with our virtual apps workloads is that they've always been historically CPU bound. So CPU is typically the bottleneck with our virtual apps workloads, which ultimately has led us to recommend more compute optimized workloads for those server OS or Windows 10 multi-session OS workloads. However, the one thing I do want to call out here that's changed in recent years is that memory consumption has really increased over the last couple of years, specifically with modern browsers. You know that Google Chrome is very often a memory hog, as well as Teams. I've seen almost every one of my customers begun to deploy Teams, which is ultimately consumed a fair amount of memory on those servers. Moving on here, let's jump into storage on public cloud. So, for those of you who may not be aware, there is an excellent feature within machine creation services that I'd like to call out called Mcs IO, also called Mcs Storage Optimization. So this is a feature released several versions ago, but has been recently developed and has been a key area of emphasis as MCS has become a critical part of the provisioning portfolio at Citrix. So MCSIO is a technology that closely mirrors the PVS cache and RAM with overflow to disk technology, where machine writes are written to a reserved portion of the machine memory and then overflown to a disk. So this is a feature that we highly recommend in order to optimize performance within public cloud, and also to reduce the overall disk requirements on those public cloud VDAs. So when we're using MCSIO, we're really optimizing those writes and not having to rely as much on the VDA disk. So we can do things like we can consider smaller disks, as well as we can recommend testing lower tier storage. You can think standard SSD and even standard hard drive disk for those OS and identity disks that are tied to the machine. So these are both ways that we can help reduce cost on the storage side while also improving performance with that MCSIO feature. All right. And then last but not least, let's get into instances. So now that we've gone through how to power manage machines and how to size them, which instance you actually pick. Now, lucky for you, you get choice overload when looking at public cloud instances. I included some examples here for each of the main public clouds. We have general purpose, burstable, compute optimized, memory optimized, GPU enabled. How do you make sense of all these, and what should you ultimately deploy for your VMs? Fortunately, we have some general guidance based on what we've seen with customers over the last couple of years. So when we're thinking about instance sizing, especially when we're looking at multiple users logging into the same machines, looking at those server OS and Windows 10 multi-session OS workloads, we generally recommend going big based on what we've seen from some of our scalability testing. So what that means is deploying larger VMs, allowing more users to get on them and really optimize the density of that specific workload. Now, that's what we've seen from a scalability perspective. However, there may, based on the goals that you may have from either a failure domain perspective, we may want to maybe looking to deploy smaller machines, so if a machine fails, less users are impacted. Or from an auto scale perspective, you want to more regularly power cycle and shut machines down. You may want to go with smaller machines just so you can allow users to more easily be logged off and drain users off of a machine so you can power it down.
I think those are some really good points, Brian, especially when people start looking at moving their on-prem VDI and virtual apps up to the cloud. Especially, I never even considered the pay-as-you-go versus the reserved instance of how many hours it would take to when you would go one route or the other. So I think that's really good information that you have in this top 6 list.
Yeah, and that's something I've seen. I've seen customers have requirements to have a 8 or 12 hour disconnect timeout where they need user sessions to be sticking around for 12 hours. So with that, we can't necessarily shut those machines down. So if they're going to be working for 6 to 8 hours, hopefully working a full day, right? And then also keeping the machines up for another 12 hours, that's looking close to a full day. So at that point, it likely makes sense to go with a reserved instance model.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on Tech Zone Live, Brian. I think these were awesome tips, and it's always a pleasure talking to you and learning from you. So thank you so much for being here.